Welcome, Jihan. Good to have you.
Thank you.
And then we have Lisa Ekstrand. She is the head of sustainability with Vestas. And Vestas designs, manufactures, installs, and services wind turbines across the globe. And with 117 plus gigawatts of wind turbines in 81 countries, they have installed more wind power than anyone else on the planet. Earlier this year, Vestas announced its sustainability strategy, sustainability in everything we do. And one of their commitments is to become carbon neutral by 2030 without using carbon offsets. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you very much.
And then we have Maxfield Weiss from the CDP. And before joining the Carbon Disclosure Project, he oversaw the Environmental Supply Chain Responsibility program at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, creating the world's first supply chain management program based on climate science. And he currently leads CDP's corporate engagement team here in Europe. Welcome, Maxfield. I'm not sure if you can hear us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
All right, good. And of course, I'd like to also introduce our resident experts from BMW sitting here next to me at the FutureForum, starting with Nicole Funk. She's an expert for direct procurement.
Hello together.
Hi, Nicole. And then next, you might have already met the next two gentlemen from the interview before, is Ralf Hattler, Head of Indirect Goods and Services, Raw Materials and Production Partners.
Hello, everybody. Nice to have you.
And Dr. Thomas Becker, Vice President of Sustainability and Mobility.
Hello.
Hi, Thomas. All right, and as mentioned before, we do have a chat, so we do invite you to use it for your comments and questions, and they will get them to me, so we try to get your answers in as your questions come in. And I would like to start by focusing just on one question from our market research and the answers. We asked how important is a sustainable supply chain to you when it comes to buying a new product? And the results were quite interesting. Because 56% said it's very important, 19% said it's important, so we have almost 80% of the people saying it is quite important for a product to have sustainable supply chain. So I'd like to ask our experts to maybe comment on this, maybe starting with you, Maxfield, since you are involved on a daily basis with the topic of CO2 and as the CDP tries to work with so many industries and companies. Were you surprised by these results?
You know, not at all. We are seeing a growing movement of people being concerned and citizens being concerned about climate change issues. We're seeing it in the student activism space. We're seeing it from employees of companies who are increasingly concerned if their companies are being transparent on climate change, if they're drugs. We're seeing investors. And just like BMW is trying to transform markets by engaging with their supply chain and sending a powerful market signal that there needs to be radical transformation of the economy, and sustainability is a standard that needs to be set in place. So too are citizens. They know that their purchasing power on their everyday goods, whether it be automobiles, whether it be retail space, whether it be the food that they purchase and ingest, all these things are market signals that gives them the power to also transform the market in their way of impact. So really excited to see these results, but to me, it's right on trend with where we are in this moment and the concern from citizens from a sustainability perspective.
Jihan, would you agree that's also true for the region of Africa?
I think that is very true, and I think there is a growing knowledge around supply chains and how it works. And I think from a local government perspective, I think local governments, they play a big role in procuring services and goods. They play a big role in procuring municipal fleet for their cities, as well as, they spend a lot of money on construction and in the different industries. So as local governments are playing a big role in that, they're also starting to become more cognizant of the supply chains and where goods are coming from. Where are they made? Is it socially responsible? What are the environmental impacts of the goods that they are procuring? And also economically, how can they stimulate the economy of these cities through the supply chains? And creating markets within their cities for the for economy, but also for reducing carbon emissions in terms of transportation of goods and services to the cities. So it's definitely taking quite a big, it's definitely becoming a big, creating more of an understanding of supply chains and the role that they play in development, sustainable development.
And Jenny, working for a company that is as large as Siemens is, were you surprised by these results? I mean, you're probably dealing with similar questions and answers on a daily basis.
Yeah, well, indeed, I'm not surprised. What we do experience every day is that the topic of sustainability is becoming more and more important for all sorts of stakeholders. And for me, your survey is actually beautiful because it also shows that the customer is valuing our efforts and that taking this responsibility as a large international company does pay off, and that it is bringing value. And of course, not only for the customers, but also for our own employees and for the investors and the societies we're active in. So it's confirming what we're experiencing, and it's motivating us and me to then put even more efforts into it.
Lisa, and it's also confirming your claim that sustainability should be in everything that you do as a company, and combined with the awareness of all of us that sustainability matters. Do you see the same trend?
No, but absolutely. I fully agree with what the previous speakers has said. And that is definitely a big trend. And perhaps if you would have done this survey 5 or 10 years ago, perhaps the result would have been a bit different. But that's really what we see, where we see things developing. And I think a lot more people are today just so much more aware that if we are to have a real impact, we really need to address supply chains. And that's, of course, also why Vestas, when launching our global sustainability strategy earlier this year, also committed to a specific CO2 reduction target for our supply chain.
So, interesting aspect. If we had done this 10 years ago, maybe we would have gotten different answers. What can you tell us about BMW Group's goals when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions in the supply chain, very specifically?
And it's interesting that we talk about 10 years ago, because 10 years ago we just focused on our first-tier suppliers. But now focusing on CO2 reduction, we have to focus on the whole supply chain. We need this transparency down to the mine. Yeah? That's totally different perspective we had 10 years ago. And that means a total change of organization for us, a total change of approaching the supply chain. Yeah? We have to understand, for example, I talked earlier about that. How is the production of cobalt? Where does lithium come from? We never ask ourselves these questions 10 years ago. But we also talk about renewable energy. Yeah? We know we cannot make it by ourselves, but we have to go in, start dialogues with our suppliers, with our raw material suppliers. How can we change the industry? How can we change each country, basically? Yeah? Because the situations in the regions are totally different. So it's a huge challenge, and maybe it's interesting to know we have more than 12,000 production locations worldwide. So we have to change all of them together with us.
And they're quite ambitious goals when it comes to reducing the CO2 emissions, and we talked about it when we were focusing on the regions of the Americas and Asia, that it really needs a holistic approach and it needs everyone to pitch in. It's not one company that can actually do it. Maxfield, I'm wondering, from the perspective of the CDP, what do you see as the biggest challenges for a company like BMW Group and their supply chain to actually make it a sustainable supply chain? And also, what are the CDP's expectations?
So corporates can be impacted by environmental risks downstream in their global supply chains, resulting in increased costs, disruption to delivery, or reputational damage, and it can be quite challenging to drive sustainable supply supply chain. And there's often limited visibility into the impacts that occur away from in areas of not in their direct control. And in some cases, it can be obscured by marketing, by commercial confidentiality, or even hesitation to address areas of risk. But the first obstacle to overcome is transparency. And companies can't manage their supply chain if they don't measure it. And every business is so unique that primary data is really what is necessary to provide those tailored insights. And industry averages aren't enough. So companies with large supply chains must request their suppliers to disclose and enable them to set ambitious targets. Expectations are that leading car manufacturers, who are already often seen as leaders within the space, step up their ambition and ensure that their entire value chain is aligned with net zero 1.5 degree future. And science says that we must cut emissions in half by 2030 and limit global warming to a net zero future by 2050 to keep off the worst effects of catastrophic climate change. And the transport sector has a really crucial role in showing policymakers that this target is doable. And this is a make or break it situation for the European Union to meet its climate targets, since 25% of emissions are in the transport sector. So to achieve this, we're asking that companies commit to aligning their targets with a 1.5 degree future by signing up to the Business Ambition for 1.5 degree pledge, showcase that this ambition is possible. And to reach net zero emissions, the first step is for companies like BMW is doing to set robust short and medium term science-based targets, which are targets that allow companies to reduce their fair share emissions in line with climate science. But long term, net zero targets also show a clear direction of travel and show investors and policymakers and consumers and other stakeholders that car manufacturers are serious about the long-term transformation that is required. So in short, we need organizations with large, complex supply chains to set expectations for their suppliers from a transparency perspective, set ambitious, and send a straight signal to their suppliers to cascade impact and ambition from a 1.5 degree perspective.
Jihan, Maxwell just mentioned the industry. This is very specific to the automotive industry, that they have very large, very complex supply chains, and Africa has a very special role in this supply chain, especially when it comes to the resources, the raw materials. Where do you see the biggest challenges for Africa, and also what are your expectations when it comes to BMW Group and what they can do to help you in that? I think we lost sound. Did we lose sound? Okay, Jihan, I think you're on mute. All right.
There we go. Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries.
Yes.
Thank you.
So yeah, I think the biggest challenge is, I think it's under, the data systems and understanding the systems, understanding the supply chains, and understanding how and where things are manufactured. And I think for the African continent, in terms of manufacturing, there aren't that many. I think the supply chains are more global, and there's a lot of cars, and a lot of it is manufactured outside of Africa, and they come into the continent. And I think, in terms of carbon emissions and supply chains in that way, it's looking at where is the raw material extracted, which in one case is in African cities. Where does it go to? Where is it being manufactured? Where are the manufacturing bases? And then coming back into African cities. So there's this link and this value chain of how and where things are manufactured that's quite interesting, but also a challenge if countries and cities don't necessarily know in terms of the data, in terms of how things are manufactured. I think as cities are and as countries are transitioning to low carbon modes of transportation, specifically within public transportation and transitioning their bus systems and their public transport to low carbon, there needs to be an understanding of what this means and how the supply chain looks and how these supply chains can potentially be developed within these countries or within Africa.
Thomas, we just heard from Ralph about the specific goals that BMW Group has, and we just heard from Maxfield how important the transparency is when it comes to especially large and complex supply chains. So, what are your plans of being transparent, fitting all of these measures into your overall sustainability plan as a group?
Very clearly, I mean, what we have been doing is to clearly define a 2030 set of targets, which are a very clear commitment and not a vision, to make that also very clear, based on the CDP's methodology and on the Science Based Target Initiative's standard for how to report. So if you look at the overarching CO2 footprint of BMW, the other target that we have been setting apart from the supply chain is to be down 40% with the emissions of our fleet by 2030, which is in line with the objectives that are pursued in the European Union, which is based on an agreement which we have, for example, with the state of California, and also obviously reflects the discussions we have in China, in Japan, in Korea, and other places. And very clearly, we will also get down by 80% in the CO2 footprint of our own production, and will compensate properly the remaining rest, where, for example, in the case of heat generation, we are not able to do this via renewable power. So from next year onward, we will say that BMW produces in a CO2 neutral manner. But as you rightly say, all of this is only credible if you are able to really properly document it, to control it, to steer it. And what we are doing, and namely Ralph's team is doing at the moment, is to really implement a very thorough system by which you can properly account for the CO2 reductions that our suppliers are doing. So we have to gradually replace the global average data, which today is in our system, by specific customer-specific, material-specific data. And this is what then goes into the target measurement system, which the board has been adopting in July, whereby BMW's management will be measured against delivering on those objectives. And finally, talking about transparency, another choice we have been making is to be the first automotive manufacturer who does integrated reporting, meaning there will be no sustainability report anymore. The last one was published in the beginning of this year, but we will integrate all aspects of sustainability into our corporate report as from next March onwards. And this will mean that our figures on, for example, the CO2 footprint will be under the same scrutiny and the same control mechanisms as our business figures. And I think this will hopefully also make very transparent what we achieve on a year by year by year basis, and not in terms of a vision for 2050 or so.
So a clear action plan and a clear commitment. Lisa, we talked a lot in our panels yesterday and today about the importance of renewable energy use within the supply chain to make it more sustainable and to keep the CO2 emissions in check. What are you expecting? What is your industry, what is your company expecting from partners like BMW Group to actually help them with their goals, and probably also your interests to bring down to lower CO2 emissions in the supply chain?
No, but of course, I mean, we as many others see that electrification will be absolutely key to decarbonize supply chains, and it won't come as a surprise that I say that of course that renewables have today become so competitive. So that is actually within reach today. I mean, I've been working for Vestas for 11 years now, and I remember when I started, and I mean, renewables were not in its early days, but it was definitely not in the position where we are today, where renewables are really on par with fossil fuels in many markets. So we have the absolutely best conditions to decarbonize supply chains with electrification. Also, I mean, we have now with the sustainability strategy, we have also taken a new approach to how we would like to collaborate with our suppliers, and we have taken the position that we want to use a very inclusive approach. I mean, we as many others have thousands and thousands and thousands of suppliers with different maturity levels, and we want to accommodate this and make sure that everyone can be part of that journey. So what we have done is that we also categorize our different suppliers in what we call beginner, intermediate, and advanced categories, and depending on where we place them, we also tailor actions and initiatives that we expect them to do going forward. And of course, part of that is also that we will expect suppliers going forward in some categories to also go for 100% renewable electricity. Yeah.
Jenny, I'm wondering, you know, as a VP sustainability for Siemens, you're also dealing a lot with renewable energies, and what are your recommendations, and also what do you see as the challenges in increasing the level of the use of renewables in a supply chain?
I mean, it's basically how can we have more renewable energy, and Lisa already talked about a little bit about the journey that they went through within the last 10 years, and that there are obviously also very much local differences. If we look into now the next level of clean energy, we do believe in obviously decarbonization and more decentralized logics, and also into more the use of digital solutions, and by this overall then reducing the emissions in the energy systems. But that said, it really differs on a country by country level how you can go this transformation. Like, unfortunately, you cannot plug this overnight, but there is great progress happening all around the world, and so that's why we are positive about this. And if we look into the next level, and I believe this will be then also supportive in the supply chains, it's obviously topics like hydrogen, which will allow to then also store and transport the renewable energy in a larger scale, and to then help to transform the energy systems. Looking into the supply chain, and I would also here connect to what Lisa said, I really believe the success factor is also to engage with your suppliers. There is great interest from the suppliers in all dialogues and also large scale surveys that we had with our 90,000 suppliers. We do see that there is more and more interest, that they want to see the solutions. So it's also our task to have this dialogue and to offer solutions. Help them to then also reduce their CO2 footprint. And I believe that's actually the way to go, and that works pretty well.
I think if I can come in here, I think we experience exactly the same. Yeah, I think it needs a lot of education process. Not everybody has to reinvent the wheel again and again and again. And there are a lot of small suppliers and raw material suppliers, etc. We somehow need a common approach, yeah, and we want to go into the leadership to that. But we need the conversation with the supply chain. We have to educate. We have to exchange information. We recognize that a lot of suppliers didn't even hear about renewable energies. Yeah, maybe they heard about it, but they have no clue how they get it from. Yeah, and these kind of things. So we really have to create this whole movement together and educate.
Yeah, and you mentioned the communication, and when we think about how large the supply chain actually is in the automotive industry, tier one alone, roughly about 12,000 suppliers, and then we have tier 2, 3, 5, etc. So it's just an immense amount of partners, of suppliers, of people to talk to. Nicole, I was wondering, from your perspective, what do you see as the biggest challenges? I mean, there's a commitment, Thomas said there's a commitment, you have ambitious goals. What are the biggest challenges when it comes to implementing this strategy?
Yes, as Mr. Hadler said, we have this match plan to move on until 2030 to go forward, and we already started this year. We put the CO2 footprint from our suppliers as a figure in the nomination process. We don't look, or we formerly looked at price, quality, security, and now we put this figure in concerning carbon footprint. And we already started with our top 30 nominations to go in deep dive with the supplier and suppliers in this value chain, and we received a lot of positive feedback. It was hard work to get really the transparency from the whole supply chain at the first time, and we have really taken these measurements with our colleagues together to create the carbon footprint, a specific carbon footprint, a carbon footprint for the supplier and the country, and our nomination where they have to deliver in the world. And this was the first step to implement this strategy, and then we have to roll out that time for more and more nominations. But currently we focus on really high energy intensive topics, recycling quotes, to decrease these carbon footprints in our supply chain.
Jihan, do you see the need for this communication in Africa with the suppliers? Do you see there's an awareness and they are looking forward to working with like the OEMs together to actually have an impact to change? Do you see an openness towards this change?
I think I definitely think so. I mean, mobility and transportation is multifaceted, and it has, it has a lot of stakeholders and role players in the whole supply chain, in the whole system of a city and of a country. And I mean, if you think about, mobility that moves goods, mobility and the transportation required for both of these different aspects, I think that coming from a local government and a national government perspective, it's also in the kind of policies that are being developed and how cities are wanting to transition and putting out policies. And I think that's where that's where the engagement comes from, where, the policy is only as good as what it is. But then it comes to engaging with the markets, engaging with citizens to understand how transitioning to a low carbon economy or low carbon, country or city would impact on the social aspect, on affordability, on how people, understand decarbonization in supply chains and in general. So I think, all of society approach to engagement is actually what's really, really important, because it is cross-sector, it is multi-governance, there's a lot of role plays involved in mobility and transportation.
And we just heard from BMW Group that there's a clear commitment, there is a plan, they want to be transparent. And I just want to go back to our market research and show one other question that we asked people. We asked, how do you evaluate car manufacturers on a scale from 1 to 5 for the most sustainable supply chain? And how would you rate the BMW Group? And we can see here that 59% gave them a fair rating, 26% said actually quite good. Ralf, how do you interpret these results?
I think that people don't know too much yet about the supply chain. Yeah, but we recognize that not just the reduction of the CO2, it's also human rights issues. All the other things are coming much more into the interest of the people. Yeah, basically every day we have this discussion. Therefore, we are clearly committed, and I repeat our statements again. It's important to understand we are not talking about Paris 2050. We want to talk about Paris 2030, and we have a clear commitment to that. And we need the suppliers to join us on this journey. And we know that we will have problems. We will make mistakes, yeah. But we have to talk about it. We have to learn out of these mistakes. And I'm 100% convinced if we approach this all together in the whole supply chain, it will be a competitive advantage for the suppliers. Yeah, but not everybody understood it so far. So we have to teach them. We want to include them. And what Nicole said, it's a change process. It's not just a program. It's a change process. And we want to include clearly the reduction ideas to reduce the CO2 in the supply chain into our tendering process. Not we want, we did already, and it will be a crucial decision criteria for us.
Maxfield, I think, those are quite interesting results. Is it a question of communication, of telling people what's actually happening, and the CDP is working with establishing standards among different industries, and at the same time trying to communicate to the general public what's going on. So do you think we just need to talk more about it and let people know what's happening?
We need to showcase what leadership is, right? We're hearing here about the benefits of large private sector organizations that can drive effective change by using their substantial procurement spend as a powerful lever for action. And this is sending a market signal that allows suppliers to continue to follow the example of the leadership set by companies. So setting out and looking at what the NGO community is calling on for companies to achieve is the first step. And the business ambition for 1.5 pledge is a good way to showcase that leadership and demonstrate what forward-looking success looks like. We see a lot of opportunity that exists in the supply chain. The supply chain is often 5 times more emissions that's occurring in the supply chain. So this is where opportunities lie. Suppliers disclosing to their customers through CDP in 2019 reported 563 megatons in annual emission savings in 2019, with $20 billion of cost savings in the process. So we need to communicate. And we have BMW who've joined CDP and 150 other purchasing organizations with a collective $4 trillion in buying power are now shining that light onto their supply chains and increasingly demanding transparency from their suppliers. We talked about renewable energy, and there's great opportunities here. We know that if sustainability of supply chains can have that enormous impact. For example, 1 gigaton of emissions, which is equal to the emissions of Brazil and Mexico combined, can be cut if suppliers reporting through CDP increase their share of renewable energy from 11% to 31%. So that opportunity exists. What we need is for set up, make these commitments to be able to expand that leadership and cascade it through not only through their supply chains, but act as an industry leading example to showcase what leadership looks like and bring everybody along that sustainability journey. Oftentimes, supply chains are shared. I work for Hewlett Packard Enterprise, and we shared our supply chains with the other electronic manufacturers. So if you can replicate that impact, replicate the ask, and communicate that impact, that's where we can have success, and supply chains are key to that.
That's quite interesting. Ralf, are you sharing results with other OEMs in the industry?
Maybe you want
Yeah.
We are together with other OEMs and as well other leaders in their branch in many initiatives for steel, aluminium, plastic industry. We work together with them and other multi-stakeholder initiatives as well with NGOs to really set up standards, and CO2 emissions are part of these development standards as well. Aluminium is on a quite way forward with the Aluminium Stewardship Initiative. Steel moves on forward very, very fast. We see a lot of interest there and a lot of possibilities to integrate social standards and then the carbon footprint for sure.
But to add, I think we are the first OEM car manufacturer who set clear CO2 targets for the supply chain. So we start this match plan, as we call it, for the next 10 years. And certainly at one stage, we have to come all together. We need everybody involved, otherwise we won't change this whole thing.
So be that lighthouse. For
yes, we want to clearly have the leadership in on our hands. We go ahead, and then we have to bring everybody together.
I have a very specific question from our chat. How do you calculate the CO2 footprint within the use phase? Do you calculate it with real driving emissions or test cycle emissions?
Well, we follow the SBTi methodology, and that means that we take the WLTP official figures multiplied with a correction factor of 1.1, which is about averaging the deviation in real life. And then this is multiplied with the overall mileage and the sales volume of our cars. So this is the method we follow. And I think this is obviously not reflecting each and every customer's real driving behavior, but I think it gets as close to reality as is possible today. And it makes things comparable because everybody who is committed to that methodology will report on the same basis.
And also takes us back to the transparency. Now we have a second question. In your manufacturing sites, scope 1, did you already switch fossil fuels to renewable energy?
Absolutely. We have, even in our Leipzig plants, we produce energy with wind turbines. We are going to expand the usage of photovoltaics. And we will conclude an increasing number of power purchase agreements in order to directly benefit from additional capacity in renewable energy. So that's very clearly part of the plan that we are pursuing.
And it's important for us. We don't expect anything else from our partners, which we cannot fulfill. So therefore, it was important that we start with our own production, and now we want to transfer this into our supply chain.
We talked about renewable energy, we talked about recycling. Maxfield and maybe Jenny, you also want to comment on this. I'm wondering, what do you see as which supplies have the biggest potential to have an impact on the CO2 footprint? Max, we can't hear you. Are you on mute?
Well,
Now you're back.
can you hear me
Yes.
now?
Yes. All right.
Well, decarbonizing transport is a fundamental issue for Europe, and the sector accounts for 25 of emissions, I said. So although manufacturers are now making large investments in low carbon R&D related to electric drive chains and automation, electric vehicles still have a small market share. So I see a big market potential in this space to, from the perspective of road transport emissions continue on the rise. So I would love to see more investment in the automobile sector in this phase of transports to engage with their supply chain that can then have reverberating impacts in the use phase as well from an electrification perspective. And it must be the case that during the recovery from the COVID crisis, investment flows into low carbon transport to drive emissions faster across the sector in Europe specifically. So this would be where my priority would lie. If I heard the question, you cut off a bit there.
Yes, thank you. So investments, but possibly also divestments. Jenny, what do you think?
Well, I would add to what Maxfield just said by saying what we really see, and that's also where we are active in, is really these different systems where mobility and transport is one. But of course, they all go hand in hand. It's about the energy production. It's about then the energy efficient usage of this energy in industry, in buildings. And yes, then the mobility and transport sector plays a very crucial role and is heavily transforming and showing new ways. In the end of the day, it's important to connect all these systems because they all impact each other. So maybe a mobility example, obviously, if you would now produce more e-cars, somewhere you need to get this electricity from. So somewhere you need to charge this, somewhere you have to ensure that the city has all this electricity needs. And so maybe you can reduce energy in buildings to have this energy then available at certain times when the cars would need it to charge. And so with that, I really believe it's important to look into all these systems and to combine them and have a holistic view on decarbonizing our cities and our countries.
Thomas, connecting the systems.
Well, I mean, this is about the huge opportunities that we see in digital. I mean, connecting the electricity, the power generation sector, and the transport sector. And just to give you one example, we have been very successfully experimenting in California together with the energy utility in the Bay Area about how to connect renewables and electric vehicles in a very simple manner. I mean, the customers just used an app telling us this is the time of the day where the car is standing still. And then whenever the utility told us, okay, now power supply from wind, for example, is low, we told the cars from our server directly to interrupt charging and vice versa. This worked extremely well. And in California, you have a regulatory framework which even makes the customer benefit indirectly because they get incentivized by the utility. And we would like to see more of that also in Europe, but it obviously depends on the regulatory environment in the different markets. And we have 27 different energy policies and energy legal systems in Europe. And this is why we need much more collaboration also in that regard, not in this supply chain of our product, but in the electricity that goes into the product in the hands of the customer.
Jihan, maybe you can also share some insights about the situation in Africa when it comes to the partnerships, the connecting the systems, and the frameworks. How do you see the current situations? And is there anything that maybe BMW Group could do to improve that, to help with the partnerships? You're on mute again. Sorry, Jihan.
Sorry. Yeah, and I think this is, sorry about that.
No worries.
This is also where ICLEI's role comes in, because we're very, this thing around peer-to-peer learning, collaboration, building partnerships is what's really important. And if we want to look at our cities as being sustainable systemically and across sectors and across role players and things, we have to, building partnerships is one of the most important things to achieve that. And so, I mean, what we, in our role in helping local governments and national, sub-regional governments understand their systems and their transitions to low carbon, sustainable, equitable cities, we are engaging in these conversations with different role players, with the NGOs, with the private sector, as well as with our cities and city officials, so that these systems can somehow connect through sharing of knowledge and through understanding. And I think suppliers. I think it's important for us to engage suppliers and for suppliers to be actively involved in the different platforms that are available to have these discussions and conversations.
We're almost at the end of our time. Maxwell, I'd like to know, does the CDP have anything on its wish list when it comes to partners like BMW Group? What can they do in the future? What can they do better or more?
I have a very concrete wish list instead of actions for BMW. And I was thinking about this morning. And we were really, past August, just a few months ago, committed to set science-based target. However, I mentioned that BMW wants to be on the leadership position in the vanguard. BMW is actually quite late to the game in terms of setting a science-based target. Over 1,000 companies have committed or have set science-based targets already, and many of the automobile companies have already done so quite a long time ago. We're really excited that BMW has joined the pack, and BMW has a long history of leadership from a sustainability perspective. We heard about integrative reporting. We've heard it in many other different cases, and I have a clear trajectory from BMW to reclaim this leadership mantle. First, we'd like to see BMW commit to the business ambition for 1.5 pledge. That's the first step. Demonstrate and showcase this leadership. It's important to send the market signal that this ambition is possible. Only one other car manufacturer has made this commitment, so this is a vanguard position for BMW. Second, I want to give BMW a way forward to reclaim the leadership position in and of itself. And that is to send a strong market signals to suppliers now that they have set robust or are committed to set robust targets within their own operations. They need to share that responsibility with their suppliers. No other automobile company is currently requiring their suppliers to set 1.5 degree aligned science-based target. That would be the vanguard. By doing so, you can help your suppliers get ahead of future stakeholder risk, take advantage of that opportunity now, and differentiate themselves as suppliers of choice. And when we think about the idea that today 20% of emissions for current vehicles, in the future in electrification, when we limit tailpipe emissions, 80% of emissions in the supply chain, this is a huge opportunity. So that's what the vanguard looks like. Once you then start working with your suppliers to set science-based targets, I encourage you to look to the rest of your industry and take this leadership position as the vanguard example to work with others to get them to also work with their suppliers to set science-based targets from a 1.5 degree perspective. This will cascade ambition throughout the automobile sector supply chain, and that's what the vanguard looks like.
Who wants to comment on that?
Thank you very much for the wish list. It's almost Christmas. No, I feel very comfortable with this wish list, to be quite honest, because that's exactly why we started this dialogue, for example, to understand the different regions as well. And this is a very ambitious wish list, but we have to cover the whole globe basically, and that's the challenge. We have to start with transparency. We want to take over the leadership, and we will take over the leadership. And as I said, we want to commit our suppliers to contribute to the CO2 reduction while we are combining their ideas, their CO2 offers into our tender process. It's not everything, but it's the start, and we have a clear 10-year plan. We will fail at the one or the other stage. We know that, but then we have to readjust this plan. But we start now, and we clearly commit ourselves to these targets until 2030.
Like you said, it is a start, and we see a clear commitment to leadership, to charging ahead, to really connecting the system in an integrated and holistic fashion. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Jihan, Jenny, Lisa, and Maxfield for sharing your insights and giving your opinions. And of course, thank you, Nicole, Ralf, and Thomas for taking the time to be on this panel. Thank you for watching this discussion. We'll be right back in about 1 minute with Dr. Wendt, member of the board, to talk about his learnings from these panel discussions and this stakeholder dialogue today. So stay healthy, stay connected, and see you in a minute.